Yeah. Family, y'all. Just keep it tight, keep it tight, keep it tight. Oh, right. Yeah. Here we go.
Should we talk about conscience and church authority then? Because now we get into this interesting issue. What happens when your conscience tells you to do one thing, but that's in conflict with these other voices that have come from the outside that have said that you should or shouldn't do certain things, especially if those voices come from the church? Take the example of being in the middle of Lent, and all of a sudden you find yourself eating that hamburger. You just took a bite out of a hamburger. It's a Friday of Lent, and suddenly you remember, oh my word, it's a Friday of Lent. I shouldn't be eating this. Shouldn't. Anytime we hear the word should or shouldn't going into our mind, where's that usually coming from? It's coming from some voice outside of us telling us that we should or shouldn't do something. Wait a minute, the church taught me, I learned in church that I shouldn't eat this. So then what happens now when your conscience, when what you're doing, or what you're thinking of doing, comes into conflict with what the church says that you should or shouldn't do? The church for many years told us that we shouldn't eat meat on Fridays. For some of us who are old enough, that was every single Friday of the year, no meat. For those of us who are a little younger, it was just Fridays of Lent. The church is telling us that we should or shouldn't do certain things. Okay? What happens now when our conscience starts asking questions about these things? So an example of conflicting orders from two respectable sources can be found in the Cain Mutiny. Are we familiar with the Cain Mutiny? So in this work, Captain Krieg orders the ship to turn around, to make a 180. Okay? So he's giving one order, turn this ship around. But the executive officer yells, steady as you go. Meaning, what do you do if you're the helmsman now? If you're the person who's responsible for steering the ship? Do you listen to the captain who's giving you one order, turn around? Or do you listen to the executive officer who's saying, keep going straight? Yikes. In the Cain Mutiny then, the helmsman responds, what the hell should I do? Right? I'm getting these two conflicting voices. Captain's telling me to turn around. The executive officer telling me to go forward. What the hell do I do? Pardon my French. And so what do we do when we start having these conflicting voices? For instance, in the world of the church, we have bishops often who say that we should do one thing, but then we have theologians who raise questions, who ask questions, and wonder if that's really the case. So for instance, in 1968 with Humanae Vitae, when the bishop said, thou shalt not use artificial contraception, things like the birth control pill or condoms, there were others, like theologians, saying, well, with all due respect, why not? What's so terrible about it? So we as Catholics then suddenly had these conflicting messages, and also the conflict created with our own experience. Wait a minute, my own experience is not necessarily telling me that this is something that's evil.
Well, how come the magisterium is referred to as the bishop?
Or maybe the other way around. It's essentially, why are the bishops referred to as the magisterium? So the bishops are the official teachers of the church, which simply means that Father Jamie can say something in class, and we like Father Jamie, but he doesn't speak with the same authority as he would if he wore a funny hat. Bishops speak with an authority that the rest of us don't. Follow me? So we can be more free to probe and to ask questions about certain things that other persons can't, simply because of their position that they're in. They have the duty, the responsibility of safeguarding the faith in a way that's more serious than any of the rest of us. So bishops have a certain teaching office, and as a result of that, we've referred to all bishops in the collective as the magisterium. The Latin word magister, or in Spanish, maestro, means teacher. So they're the teachers of the church. To be part of the magisterium means that you're part of the teaching office of the church. If you're a bishop or higher within the hierarchy, you're part of the magisterium, which is a big responsibility, because none of us wants to mislead another person. At the same time, especially if you're a bishop, if you're in that position, the higher you are in an organization, the more people you can lead astray potentially. So we have bishops who are in the official role as teachers of the church saying certain things, right? They're the Captain Queeg saying, turn around, do a 180, don't use birth control or artificial means contraception. Wait a minute. And then you have the executive officers who are giving us different messages saying, wait a minute, we're just trying to be responsible. My own experience tells me that by using the pill, if I'm a woman, artificial contraception, condoms, etc., that it's my way of being responsible and not having a pregnancy that I can't handle for whatever reason, or preventing disease, etc. Oh, conflicting voices. Isn't it true that we all rely on experts in different areas of our life? So that, for instance, I don't know a lot about health, but if I needed to know something about health or something that's happening with my body, a certain pain that I have, there are certain experts who could probably tell me, give me a better idea of what's happening with my body. I would go and see a doctor, for instance, or I'd pull Raphael aside after class and say, Raphael, I'm having this pain. Any idea what this is? There are different experts, people who know more than me in certain areas. All of us could probably think of areas where there are other people who know more than us about certain things. There are certain people who are experts in real estate, or in law, or in health, or in construction, or in teaching, you name it. There are people who know all sorts of things that we don't know. Okay, so if there are experts in other fields, then why shouldn't we think that there are experts as well when it comes to things dealing with the church? Ideally, the bishops of the church would be those experts, if you will. Those people who've thought about these issues, who aren't just being faithful to those above them, but who have some credibility as experts. The challenge then becomes when those who are in authority assert themselves, creating for us the obligation to assent, meaning when they come out with teachings expecting us to believe what they say and to do what they say we need to do. Follow me? So in whatever teaching it is, if it's a teaching on the role of women in the church, John Paul II said there will be no conversation about women in the church, case closed. Okay? From that point forward, we dissented if we were having conversations about the role of women in the church. Follow me? Bishop John McCarthy loved the man, really one who was willing to dissent within the church, which likely explains why it is that the Vatican accepted his resignation. All bishops have to give the resignation at a certain age. Some are accepted, some aren't. They could not wait to accept his resignation. Why? Because he was one of those who, when he was having lunch with John Paul II, was able to talk about how it was that, here in the United States, we're having a conversation about what would be so terrible about ordaining women. Wait a minute. The Pope was clear. We are not going to have a conversation on this. So, once we start having the conversation, we are dissenting. So then the challenge becomes, when those in authority say, because I'm the Pope, or because I'm the bishop, or because I am in whatever role I am, then you must listen to me and do as I say. And if I say, thou shalt not use birth control, then what does that mean for you? Thou shalt not use birth control. Do you see the cognitive dissonance that this creates in our lives? Wait a minute, what happens when this goes against our own life experience? Or about what we think is right or wrong, good or bad? Or, in our talking with other people, how can this be so terrible? But I have this person who's giving me a message. It's the same sort of thing that we have in the lives of parents and children, right? Can we all not think of an example of someone else in some role outside the church telling us to do something where we're just like, okay, that's not what I want to do. Teenagers, imagine the parent telling the teenager, come on, let's go to church. Okay? Can you imagine a teenager pushing back against his or her parent? He's essentially saying, wait a minute, that may be what you want to do, that's not what I want to do. Right? Conflicting how it is that we get into these conflicts. Commanding officers with their soldiers. Okay, if you're a soldier, your job is to obey. That's your job. Your job is not to question me. I'm your commander. I have to make decisions. Hopefully most of them are going to be good. Some of them may be bad, but regardless, I'm the commander. And so that's sort of the analogy. Some of those analogies might be what we use with bishops and laity. There are just some bishops who are more heavy-handed. Fortunately, in the American Catholic Church, we've not had bishops who are so authoritarian, heavy-handed, saying, you must do these things, so much as we see bishops in other places who really come down with who take some hard stances on some issues. So there are some advantages of the magisterium. Thank God for bishops and those who are official teachers in the church, because they help to bring together various insights and experiences and give us some direction. So on the one hand, we're thankful for them. Various disadvantages of having people in a teaching office like that is that sometimes not all perspectives are represented. Every time I see a photo coming out of the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops, essentially when all the Roman Catholic bishops of the United States come together, you see a photo of all of them working, and what do you instantly notice about that picture? Are all perspectives of all American Catholics represented in that room? What are the voices that are excluded? People like women, people like those who are younger. It just seems that bishops are usually of a certain age and a certain gender and a certain lifestyle. They're all they all profess celibacy. There are so many perspectives that are missing when they teach on any issue. Other disadvantages, that often the magisterium can be more institutional than personal. Isn't it true in any organization? When we talk about the magisterium, it sounds like this Wizard of Oz power or something. Wait a minute, those are actually people. That magisterium is made up of people like us. But when you call them the magisterium, it just sounds like this thing rather than the people who actually comprise it. Sometimes the magisterium can be less collaborative and cooperative. Instead of asking us and formulating the views based on different perspectives, they come to their own judgments on certain things. And also one of the challenges that's especially pertinent to those of us who are part of the independent Catholic tradition is that sometimes these things cross into matters of conscience. In the American Catholic Church, we have always said, leave issues of conscience to the conscience, right? You, for whatever reason, are making a decision in this situation, hopefully informed by our faith tradition, informed by Scripture and the Church's tradition and the magisterium. Take all those into account. But ultimately, you're making a decision that's a matter of conscience. We in the American Catholic Church have tended to leave issues of conscience to the conscience. If your conscience is telling you to do a certain thing and you believe that that is right, then who am I to say that you're going to hell, or that you're doing something that's objectively evil, meaning would be considered evil by all people in all situations of all time. So, what the Roman Church has traditionally asked is of submission of the will and mind. Think of that phrase for a moment. That essentially we submit our will and our mind to the teachings of the magisterium, that we try to understand them. So, it's not meant to silence us or to create merely external conformity, but rather it's trying to be honest with ourselves and struggling with what it is that the messages that we've gotten. So I may be of some other opinion. So with respect to birth control, okay, the bishops are telling me something about birth control. I have this contrary opinion where I'm not sure that it's such an evil, terrible thing. The Roman Church's perspective on that has typically been submission of will and mind, meaning that it's asked for us to submit to the teaching. The American Catholic Church has been more open to dialogue about these things. Well, let's talk about it. Let's talk about why it is that the church, meaning various bishops, would say that something is right or wrong, good or bad. There is a certain respect for teaching authority, which even we in the American Catholic Church it gives us pause to consider. If Archbishop Johnson walks into the room, he is a teaching authority in the church, and so it just seems that it would demand some serious attention. Whatever he says would demand at least us to listen to what he says and to really take that into consideration, to pray about it. Father Richard Gula says that we receive the teaching with an openness which is ready and willing to make the teaching our own. We really try to be open to what it is that we're hearing, and we give the presumption in favor of magisterial teaching a strong initial preference. So there's this presumption in favor of it that we start off with. So when Bishop Johnson, Bishop Vasquez, any bishop walks into the room, they're in a teaching position. We try to be open. There's this presumption that we make that what he or she is saying as bishop is that there's something to that he or she is speaking for our tradition. Beyond an attitude of openness, though, the magisterium, no bishop can impose any further obligations on personal conscience beyond openness. They can ask us to be open, to pray about it, to consider it, but beyond that, our conscience ultimately is the rule, which is why St. Francis of Assisi, back, 800 years ago, told his friars, his brothers, if the Pope tells you to do something, but it's against your conscience, which do you follow, said St. Francis? St. Francis said, follow the conscience. Follow your conscience. 800 years ago, St. Francis, anticipating conflicts between the magisterium, the Pope, and your conscience. Which did you follow? Conscience. Vatican II's Declaration on Religious Freedom said that our judgment must include the Church's teaching. So when we think about these things, we should think about the Church teaching and include that as part of our decision making. Whether or not we decide to do it in the end, we should at least be open to and consider that teaching as part of our own decision making. So if the bishops tell me, thou shalt not use artificial means of contraception, I should at least be open to listening to that wisdom, even if in the end, for whatever reason, I decide not to follow that in whatever specific circumstances I find myself. So then, Father Richard Gula says, the Catholic ought to give a strong initial preference to what is being taught. The Catholic ought to treat the teaching as a co-determining factor in making the decision, even though it may not be the decisive factor when all things are considered. We should at least consider the Church teaching, whatever the Church says on whatever issue we're facing, even if that's not the deciding factor in the end in my decision. Which is why Father Richard Gula, a good Roman Catholic priest in good standing with his Church, says, for instance, the choice to use artificial contraception is a prudential judgment and should not be confused with dissent. Think about the radical nature of that statement by a Roman Catholic priest. So just because I choose to use artificial contraception doesn't mean that I'm dissenting. It means that I'm making a prudential judgment. I'm being prudent. I'm doing what I believe is good and right and prudent in that situation. Cardinal Carter of Toronto, Canada, spoke a similar line in the 1980s where he said, the conscience determines what we can or can't practice for practical reasons, and this is not dissent. Your conscience decides what you can and cannot do in certain situations. Remember back during the Vietnam War, what was happening? We had conscientious objectors. Who are they? They were people who believed. Their conscience said, I cannot do what I'm being asked to do, for whatever reason. Okay? So a conscientious objector. The conscience tells us what we can or cannot do in certain situations, and that should not be confused in the Church. That shouldn't be confused with dissent. You're following your conscience. You're listening to that voice inside your heart, inside your mind, that voice within, that is your conscience, which is telling you that certain things are good, bad, right, or wrong, and there are sometimes conflicting voices that come to us from the outside with respect to what it is that we should or shouldn't do.
St. Francis, his prayer is so moving. He wishes he knows the difference. You know, he's dealing with the conscience, and that's why his prayer is so strong. The American GI Forum always use that prayer as a...
What I'm hearing you say is it not similar to the serenity prayer? What is the serenity prayer? Lord, give me the serenity to accept those things that I cannot change, the courage to change those things that I can change, and the wisdom to know the difference. There's something about this gift of wisdom that we ask for. When it comes to making moral decisions, there's something to be said for stopping and praying for wisdom. Interestingly, the Eastern Orthodox Catholics, the Orthodox Catholic Church, before they proclaim the gospel, rather than sing Alleluia, we sing Alleluia all the time, for them, they sing, wisdom be attentive. I just think, what a beautiful prayer.
So,
If I have one, for me, when I'm making hard decisions in life, my prayer is wisdom, be attentive.
But sometimes
I
you
want
have
wisdom.
to go against, when you're going against some authority, that
Wisdom.
comes in.
You need to pray for wisdom.
And I hope I make the right decision. That's what actually is saying, what,
When I invited a Roman Catholic U.S. Hispanic congressman to come to Cristo Rey to speak about immigration reform, that was controversial. You better believe that I prayed for wisdom because I had other voices telling me, thou shalt not do this. This man is Roman Catholic, Hispanic, a champion of immigration. Okay, some could consider what I did foolish, but at the end of the day, it was doing what I felt I needed to do in that
what you
situation.
think is right.
Do I keep voices like that away from the people, talking about immigration reform and their dignity as people? Or do I follow these voices that say, thou shalt not do certain things? Thou shalt carry the party line on certain issues. That gets tough. When your conscience, when your heart is telling you, boy, I can no longer carry that party line on certain issues. The place of women in the church, I just can't do it. I'm sorry, but for the sake of all my sisters, I believe it's the 21st century. Eventually, the entire church is going to step into the 21st century. Until then, I need to step into the 21st century, and I'll look forward to welcoming you all when you decide to step into the 21st century yourself. I can no longer continue to oppress my sisters. Can't do it. Pains me. Follow your conscience. St. Francis of Assisi, 13th century, early 1200s. If the Pope and your conscience collide, how fascinating that instead of saying follow the Pope, he said follow your conscience. That was
But if we
subversive.
follow our conscience, we're descending from the Pope.
So you could perceive it as that, and many in the church perceive it as that. If you don't do what I said to do, then you're dissenting. What does Father Richard Gould say? You're exercising prudential judgment. St. Francis of Assisi, the concrete example that he always gave in the 13th century was, if you're fasting and the church says to fast, but you absolutely cannot fast, or if there's someone else in your company who just absolutely, for whatever reason, cannot fast, then you offer that person meat or food, and you even offer to eat with that person. That is following the gospel, following the model of Jesus, more than saying, sorry, know you're hungry, I'm hungry too, but we can't eat. St. Francis was not a hard-line, follow the church sort of guy. He was a revolutionary for the 13th century.
So then also the church can also be descending on its own people to follow it. Because they have these rules that we have to follow. But if we do not follow, we're descending from the church. But at the same time, they're descending from us to become with the church.
So I think what I'm understanding from what you're saying is that what happens if you're the leader, then you're typically walking with the people. But what happens if the people are walking in a certain direction and you're no longer walking with them? There is a certain dissent by the magisterium of the church if they're not following the sense of the people. If they're coming out with some statement, here in the United States, we tend to be going on a trajectory where we see our sisters, all of our sisters and brothers as equal. Okay? When the magisterium continues to go down this path of saying, no, we're not equal, as St. Paul said, male or female, we're all one in Christ. No. If we continue to enforce these structures, wait a minute, it seems that you're really dissenting, if you will. You're going in another direction from where we're going as a people. What do you do with that? The cynics among us tend to point to persons like those who said Nietzsche, those who are in power. Karl Marx tend to do things to stay in power. What does that tell us about structures like the church? Those who are in power in the church tend to do things to stay in power. If we open up the doors of ministry to women, got news for you, that's going to change the structure here. Those who are in power tend to want to stay in power.
Also, if priests are allowed to marry.
If priests are allowed to marry, that's going to change our structure. That's a great example.
I think it was St. Francis that used to pray that he not be so obstinate as to his own opinion. Because in part, I think that's beautiful especially as we get older. And as you said, you know, the hierarchy doesn't have young people in there, we don't have females in there. So a lot of the decisions is like a bunch of men talking about contraception or talking about
There you go.
abortion.
There you go.
What do you know, sir, about, I saw a rosary today and I didn't like it, you know, it was on television and the guy kept talking about abortion. And he was kind of judging people that have had abortions. You know, and you look at the guy, you know, and he's probably never even been out on a date, you know. I didn't like that rosary. You know, Alice, we both sat there, you know, and she didn't have any problem with it. But I did, you know, because if somebody's had an abortion, they had an abortion.
That's
Man.
right.
They made a decision. God
Move
bless
on.
them.
That's
You know,
right.
right or wrong, whatever.
Amen. Move
You
on.
know, I love you anyway.
What is Jesus? I mean, for us, we're in a chapter we're going to get to soon. We ultimately have to look at the model that Jesus gave to us and ask ourselves, what would Jesus do in these situations? Is it more like Jesus to judge a person and condemn them for what it is that they did, or is it more Jesus's thing to say, wait a minute, is no one else throwing a stone? I'm not throwing any stones either. Go in peace. Your sins are forgiven. The Pharisees were the one who judged others. Wait a minute. This should cause us to pause and think, wait a minute, are we following the Pharisees or are we following Jesus? And if you're more merciful, then you're probably following Jesus. If you're more judgmental, then you're probably following the Pharisees. Conscience, though? What is the conscience? It's simply the case that there is some voice within ourselves that tells us what is right and what is wrong. Normally, as human beings, what happens is that these voices, when we're babies and children, these voices come to us from the outside, telling us what's right and what's wrong, what's good or what's bad, telling us to do certain things or to not do certain things. Be quiet, sit down. You think of all the adult voices that have talked to you during the years. Those voices get into our head and we start internalizing all those voices. The example that Father Richard used in his book is of a father who goes and yells at his son because his son got up at like 6 o'clock in the morning, and he's not aware of, it's time for him to get up. So he's up and he's making noise, and the father says, go back to bed. And the boy, goes back to bed and, starts getting rested or whatever. The father comes back and yells again. And says whatever strong message the father says. Be quiet, etc. What happens was, okay, this boy is getting these messages from the outside. Father Richard tells the story in this book of how it was that that boy, when the father went back a little later and noticed that things were quiet, went back to the door and he heard his son saying to himself.
And it depends on the culture they're coming from. If you're in a culture that doesn't teach you anything, that you do whatever you want, and your parents don't care,
Geert Hofstede says, what is culture? He says it's the software of your mind. Think about it for a moment. Because essentially it's how you're programmed to think. Whether you're programmed to make up your bed or not results from your culture, how you're programmed to think. So simply put then, conscience is me coming to a decision, says Father Richard Gula. It's not the voices from the outside telling you what you should do and forcing your decision one way or another. No, it's you coming to a decision. What do you want to do in this situation?